Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Hi, I'm Roberto Mazza, and this is Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Christopher Burhnham. Christopher is the author of Sir Ronald Storrs, Personality and Policy in Mandate Palestine, 1917-1926. We had the chance several times to discuss the work and agency of Ronald Storrs. But it's important to keep the research active and understand the legacy of this man over the contemporary history of Jerusalem. So this volume, produced by Christopher, is based on the personal paper of Sir Ronald Storrs, as well as other archival materials, in order to make a micro-historical investigation of his period as governor of Jerusalem between 1917 and 1926. The book builds upon Ederswade's work on Orientalism, determining imprint, and it argues that Storrs took a deeply personal approach to governing the city, one determined by his upbringing, his education in the English private school system, and his service as a British official in Colonial Egypt. The work of Chris recognizes the influence of his experiences on Storrs' perceptions of and attitudes towards Jerusalem, identifying how these formative years manifested themselves on the city and in the governor's interactions with Jerusalemites of all backgrounds and religious beliefs. The book then also highlights the restrictions placed on Storrs' approach by his British superior, Palestinians, and the Zionist movement, alongside the limitations imposed by his own attitudes and worldview. So, placing Storrs' personality at the center of discussions on early Mandate Jerusalem exposes a nuanced and complex picture of how personality and politics collided to influence its everyday life and built of the environment. It also gives us the chance to see how Jerusalem was shaped by Ronald Storrs, and while he might have been forgotten and neglected, his face is still defining many corners of the city. But before we delve into all of that, first things first, Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Now, to start with, can you tell us something about yourself, the origins of your research that eventually led to the publication of this book?
Absolutely. So it was quite a lengthy journey one way or another. So my interest in Storrs started as an undergraduate when I was at Royal Holloway. And my supervisor at that time, Professor Vanessa Martin, had just purchased Storrs' papers on microfilm. And she suggested that there was a possibility that someone should go in there, have a little look and see if they could come up with a third-year dissertation. And what happened was I went along, started to have a look, and found that there was a real hook in terms of Storrs' level of culpability and blame for the Nabi Musa riots in particular. And so from that undergraduate dissertation came a lifelong interest, so to speak. So there was always a little germ in my head of, there's more to be said about this guy, there's more research to be done, because as I was doing my undergrad dissertation, so much of it was hinging on his personality. There was so much mention of he had this unique approach, and it was very heavily personalized, and it had always been in the back of my mind. I went on to train and become a secondary school history teacher, and then the opportunity came along in 2018 to actually do PhD level research on Storrs at the European Centre for Palestine Studies with Ilan Pape as my supervisor. And so what I did was I combined my PhD whilst also teaching part-time, and from that came this came my thesis, and then ultimately came the publication as well.
This is a work dedicated essentially to one individual, one figure, Sir Ronald Storrs. Can you speak about the importance to look into this particular character in relation to the history of Jerusalem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to kind of conceptualize the fact that it was a period of change and uncertainty within Jerusalem and Palestine more generally. The introduction of the military government in late 1917 going into 1918 ultimately created opportunities for individuals to leave a mark in one way or another. There wasn't necessarily formal structures in certain aspects of it. And what happened is Storrs really steps up during military rule in particular and starts to create a very personalized vision of what he believes Jerusalem should be. And that's based on his personal interests, that's based on his background, and it's based on his understanding of what his role is in Jerusalem as well. And ultimately what happens is we see a reconceptualization to some extent of the city. It becomes more of a city that is now conceived as having an old section and a new section with clear divides. There's a tension between the idea of preservation and progress as well. And Storrs, through his own personal interest, very much kind of looks at the preservation of the old city in particular as being a vehicle almost to create a legacy for himself. So that's kind of the importance there, is when we think of Jerusalem nowadays as being the old city and the new city, Storrs has a huge impact on that happening.
Now, let me be an advocate's devil. A historian, and no names here, once told me that there was no need to write anything more about Ronald Storrs, as everything of relevance was already being written and said. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I'm thankful that my examiners and my publisher didn't agree on that front. But I think the interesting thing about Storrs and why people come back to him is this maddening, as some people have described, claim that he was not either for the Arabs or for the Jews, but he was for both. And so what we see is this contested legacy where he's lionized by some. He's called the foremost Englishman in the Middle East by T.E. Lawrence. He's despised by others. He's an anti-Zionist. He's anti-Palestinian. He's self-serving. He's a fantastic official. What I felt wasn't there was why. Why is it that one individual can have so many different interpretations? Because it went beyond simply British policy. Otherwise, every single British policymaker would have been tarred with the same brush. But at certain points, it's so personalized, these attacks on Storrs. And so in my mind, I kind of started to look at the idea of his background. That's really key. And also there's a danger as well with Storrs that we say, well, he is this, he is that, he's anti-Zionist, he's anti-Arab. But there wasn't an awful lot looking at what was he intending to do at the time. There was almost these retrospective labels put on him. And so my aim was really to start to think about, well, what were his intentions at that time? And try and then work from that point instead of the retrospective looking at the labels, and saying, oh, he's this, he's that.
Now, let's talk about Ronald Storrs. The making of Ronald Storrs is a very interesting process throughout the book. Can you tell us more about the man, his background, and also the worldviews which obviously influence his agency in Jerusalem, but also throughout his career?
Yeah, so he's the son of an Anglican priest, first of all. I think that's really important, John Storrs. And so it's interesting that he initially, as a young man, when he was about 10 to 12, was talking about going into the priesthood. And so the father figure is very important there. And then his mother as well, Lucy Anna Maria Cockayne Cust, had a real sense of aesthetics. There's letters between Storrs and his mother when he's away at private school where they discuss furniture that's going to be put in his room, or what sort of door handle would look good with this, and so on and so forth. And so you really see there's these two kind of key pillars that emerge from his mother and his father, this love of the aesthetic and also this absolute pillar, this bedrock of faith in Anglicanism. And then what you have meeting that is his time at two schools, Temple Grove Prep School and then later Charterhouse. Now, Temple Grove became known as the Cradle of Empire. That was kind of the colloquial nickname that was given to it, because it was seen as kind of being a good almost starting ground for people to go into imperial careers. And then later at Charterhouse, he is a student there at the time of the Boer War. And there are former members of the school, former students of Charterhouse, who are in constant correspondence with the school. And it's a key feature of the school magazines. The Carthusian was the name of the magazine there. And they would discuss what was going on at this time. And so what we see at Charterhouse is a shift away from this desire to go into the priesthood towards something perhaps more imperially minded, but it's imperial mindset with a social or civic duty as well, because he is heavily influenced by one of his teachers at Charterhouse, a man called T. Page, who ultimately kind of taught Storrs the importance of doing a social and civic duty as well. So we've got this twin mindset almost coming in now of imperial duty with a civic mindset, so to speak, that your aim is to actually lessen the burden on people as much as you possibly can. And Storrs kind of uses that in his mindset as something that he keeps coming back to as well. He goes on to Cambridge and reads classics there. And at Cambridge, he has an incredibly wide social circle. There are some really vivid descriptions of what he was like as a young man. Kind of very much the life of the party, so to speak. And what we see there is kind of a real desire to have society, keep society, keep lots of friends around, be interested in various different things going on. And there we see the influence of his uncle, a man called Harry Cust, who was one of the foremost students from Eton. And they spoke of him in some senses as being a future prime minister. It turned out he later went on to become an MP. He never went on to become prime minister. But Harry Cust was very much of that kind of mindset where the idea of having a wide social circle, of having lots of entertainments and so on and so forth was really key. And Storrs looked up to him massively. Before he goes into imperial service, he spends a period of time after he's graduated from Cambridge learning Arabic from whilst at Cambridge as well. And then he enters imperial service and he serves in Egypt from 1904 to 1917. He worked his way up throughout his time period there. Initially is incredibly homesick. His letters home to his mother speak of him being a failed graduate, of being missing his home. He even talks about coming back and being a school inspector at certain points. And there's this sense that he's very, very isolated and very lonely. And he dislikes desk work as well. He dislikes being behind a desk. His happiest moments are when he's out and about and kind of exploring and learning new things. And so what happens is he starts to basically carve a little niche for himself. The higher up he goes in the Egyptian service, the more he starts to get involved in cultural affairs. He becomes a patron of a museum out there in Egypt. And so he really is almost trying to find almost like a surrogate for all of those social interests and cultural interests that he developed at Cambridge. He then goes to Iraq in 1917. He's there very, very briefly. And what happens is there's another influence before he goes to Iraq in the form of T.E. Lawrence, because he's involved in Lawrence's voyages to Arabia at the time when Britain is looking to try and get an Arab revolt of some sort going on. And again, T. Lawrence is a really influential character for him. He sees him as a brilliant mind, as someone who, like Storrs, tries to offer almost like an innate understanding of what the Arab wants, so to speak, to use the language of the time. And so what we see in those kind of formative years, his background, his time at school, that thread of homesickness, all the threads are there for actually what he's going to do in Jerusalem. So that need for society, that love of culture, that political intrigue that he got when he was chief political officer in Egypt, and then when he went out to Arabia with T.E. Lawrence as well. It's all there. Before he arrives in Jerusalem. And then when he gets to Jerusalem, he actually has the opportunity to try and do some of those things that were important to him.
Now, you talked about Egypt. So now let's move to December 1970. Storrs is in Jerusalem, and he was not meant to be named governor, but eventually was. Can you speak about the early days of his rulership and his relations with the various communities of Jerusalem?
Yeah, so he is only meant to be in Jerusalem for 10 days. He arrives just after Allenby has gone into Jerusalem. And he openly says, I would have loved to have been there. You know, this would have been such a huge moment for me. It's not the first time that he's visited. He had visited with his uncle Harry Cust as well, and I think there's a real sense that when he arrives in Jerusalem, he's not just carrying kind of an imperial baggage, he's carrying personal baggage as well, because by this point Cust is dead. And so he recollects on the fact that his previous visit to Jerusalem, that Cust went to a British Bible Society to try and buy a Bible, and he reflects on that in his early days there. He meets the incumbent governor at that time, Borton, who's an unwell man who is not settled in Jerusalem at all, and eventually is removed from his post on the grounds of ill health, and that's where Storrs actually takes over. And what we have is an opportunity where he has an awful lot of autonomy and freedom in those early days. He described himself as having the power of a benevolent despot. That was his wording when he arrived there. And just as in Egypt, where he loved being visible and proactive, he suddenly starts to imprint that on the city of Jerusalem as well. He is going out, he's on the streets, he's enacting change. You know, these are the happiest times for him when he is out and about. And so there are food shortages, and he makes sure that he is a visible presence when food is being organized and so on and so forth, because he now has this additional kind of opportunity to go out into the city and meet the people who are there. The other thing as well is that he is, in his career, he's been a civilian, and now all of a sudden he's in a military administration, so he gets given a military rank as well. And what happens is he very keenly senses that the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration South, which is what Jerusalem falls under, is governed by the status quo. The 1907 laws of war say that there should be a status quo that is maintained during the occupation. And he argues that he's broken this status quo twice in his early days in Jerusalem. And both of them really fit in with his personality, you know, the way that he viewed the world, that love of the ascetic, that defense of tradition, and so on and so forth. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, for example, the Franciscans had built a new chapel, and Storrs had to allow this to go because the Franciscans owned the land. And for him, though, the thing that hurt him the most about this breach of the status quo was the fact that it was changing the garden from how it would have been in the time of Christ. There was this idea that somehow the garden must have been in stasis and never changed at all in those 1900 years. And so that is one key thread. And then the other thread that kind of comes through is there was a rubble wall in the grotto of the Nativity in Bethlehem. He describes it as a hideous monstrosity, an eyesore. And he signs the documents to say that wall's got to go, you know, because it's not aesthetically pleasing. I don't care what the function was, why it was there. It just doesn't make the place flow, so we're going to get rid of it. And then he does eventually acknowledge that there's one further breach in his early time there, and that's Zionism. And he says that, you know what, we are an administration that's tasked with enacting the Balfour Declaration. And it's important to bear in mind that it's not a clear policy at that point, how it's going to be enacted, what exactly it means. The Balfour Declaration is issued on the 2nd November 1917, and then we're in early 1918, and it's not clear quite how the British government is going to pursue this. And so very early on, in March of 1918, it's announced that the Zionist Commission are going to be visiting Palestine on an exploratory mission. And Storrs' response is one of uncertainty, not coming from a position of anti-Zionism, but actually because of the timing, because he says, well, we don't necessarily know what our position is at the moment in Jerusalem and in Palestine more generally. The war is still ongoing. And so what we see in those very early stages where he starts to breach the status quo is Jerusalem as a biblical site, a place that needs to be venerated as a biblical site. His personal ascetics coming through with the Grotto of Nativity, and then also that sympathy for Zionism. And so his relations with the community of Jerusalem really is where the personal and the political entwine, where he kind of tries to put his own mark on things, whilst also trying to do the political work that is required of him as a British official. And a lot of his contemporaries viewed him as unique in this approach, this very personal approach at the time. And he said that in his early days there that Jerusalemites were deserving of the very closest attention, providing they were towing the line and they weren't causing too much trouble as well. There is that caveat on there as well. And what happens is that we see that he raises and dashes the hopes of Palestinian Arabs and Zionists through this personal approach, because he builds links with groups and then builds confidences with them, but ultimately has to also be doing the work that he is paid to do as a British official as well. And so his attempts to show those interests in the communities mean that he puts himself in the communities of Jerusalem, means he put himself in this kind of vulnerable position, so to speak, where he will be open to criticisms. That's not to say that the British administration always had his back, though, in those early days. So very early on, a new chief administrator is appointed in 1919, Major Watson. Storrs thought he might have got the position himself, but was overlooked, according to him, for not being sufficiently pro-Zionist on that front. Again, this idea that he's somehow built links with the Arab community somehow counted against him in his view. And what happened is Watson requests Storrs' dismissal fairly early on in his tenure, saying that he was too preoccupied with religious politics and friendships. And Storrs defended his position on this, but it shows the difficulties of personalized approach, because he's getting criticism from all sides, not just from the Zionists or from Palestinian Arabs, but also from the British as well.
Yeah, what is interesting about Storrs is the fact that he actually was in power for 8 years, which is quite a long appointment, given the fact that first he survived the transitions from military to civil rule, and then for a number of years he effectively controlled Jerusalem. Obviously, there was the new machine, the mandatory machine coming into place, so his agency was reduced. But I always believe that it was very interesting to see that he was able to keep his position for a longer period of time compared to other colonial administrators that not necessarily kept positions for such a long period of time.
Yeah, and I think as well, when civilian administration kicks in, he has a good relationship with Herbert Samuel. And there is a kind of a sense from Samuel that if Storrs is getting it from both sides, then he must be doing a good job. If he's not getting criticism from one side and only being criticized from the other, then there's a problem. But the fact that there's criticism from both for Samuel is like, oh yeah, this is reassuring. You know, this is a good thing. You clearly are doing your job properly on that front. And I think that relationship that he had with Samuel also possibly accounted for his longevity, because it's not long after Samuel departs as the High Commissioner that we see Storrs moving on as well.
Now, in the introductions, you talk about how Storrs is often remembered for the pro-Jerusalem society. And I would love to talk about it and explain how myself, in my own work, I did a bit of research on if and how people on the streets of Jerusalem. Remember, first Ronald Storrs and then the pro-Jerusalem Society, and obviously the answer was like no one, which is an interesting experiment. But it's true that for those who are working on this period of time, certainly the pro-Jerusalem Society is a very important organization to look at. Now, this is a fascinating, shall we say, again, call it organization, even though it was probably something different. One that, as I mentioned, also has driven my own work. And I'm still trying to find, for instance, all of the minutes of the organization's meetings because they're being scattered, lost, and they're very hard to find. Can you tell us more about the organizations, the Pro-Jerusalem Society, its scope and work?
Yeah, so it's very much the civic arm of the military administration is kind of how Storrs saw it. And he was keen that it would bring all the communities of Jerusalem together for the good of the city and its inhabitants. His own role, he described it as, I am the military governor civically and aesthetically in council. So that was kind of his approach on that front. And in order to assist him with his work there, he appointed a technical assistant by the name of Charles Ashby, who was a disciple of William Morris. And there's a personal link between the two, that Ashby actually came to speak at Charterhouse while Storrs was a student, and this lecture stuck with Storrs. And so when he got to Jerusalem, he made the call out and got Ashby out there. And so the aim of the society really is working towards the preservation and advancement of the interests of Jerusalem, its district, and its inhabitants. But it's very much on his terms as well. There are certain projects that are very much driven by his personal interests and how he conceives the city. The funding for the society would be from donations around the world. And for example, in 1923, Storrs actually goes to America on a fundraising mission for the Pro-Jerusalem Society. But there are examples of newspapers in Australia making mention of it and talking about the work and suggesting that donations should be made as well. And it had various projects on the go. And one of the most notable was the establishment of something called the Dome of the Rock Tiles, where an Armenian ceramicist called David Ohanessian was drafted in, ostensibly to look at the refurbishment of the Dome of the Rock, which to Storrs' mind had been neglected under Ottoman rule and was in need of new tiles and so on and so forth. But there's also a real sense that it's having an impact on the individual lives in Jerusalem. And a really good example of that would be the removal of a clock tower over Jaffa Gate, which was put in under Ottoman rule in 1906. And Storrs hated it. He said it was a terrible eyesore. It had to go. And there's this real sense that it's a literal removal of time. There is no longer a clock there, but it's also an attempt to try and return the old city back to biblical times as well on that front. And there's other ventures that the Pro-Jerusalem Society attempts to kind of set up. So there's a glass blowing using craftspeople from Hebron. There's an attempt to set up a weaving school. Both of these fail. But he has more success with a school of ceramics, which is basically a branch of the Dome of the Rock Tiles. And what happens is these kind of the Dome of the Rock Tiles and the school of ceramics start to create what Roberts has called creative anachronisms. In other words, it's a version of the past based on Storrs' views, you know. So there's this real sense that the work that they are producing is designed to preserve the biblical aura of Jerusalem, so to speak. It's always looking back to what was as opposed to what is going to be in the future, you know. And so what we see under civilian rule, I would say that the Pro-Jerusalem Society achieves more during military rule, or under civilian rule, as civilian governance is put in, the roles and responsibilities become blurred more, and there's you've got government branches taking its role. And I don't think it's any coincidence, if we're thinking about this idea of it being quite a personal organization as well, that it gets wound down when Storrs leaves Cyprus in 1926. And so that's kind of the key thing, is it's all the time, it's this idea of creative anachronisms, but according to Storrs' views and how he's viewing the city and what it should be.
Now, let me talk about urban planning. which is another aspect of Ronald Storrs' work and partly of the pro-Jerusalem society. Can you tell us how was Jerusalem envisioned by Storrs and his associates?
Yeah, so it's very much the urban planning of Jerusalem at this time is balancing Storrs' own interests in biblical preservation together with the needs of the city, and then also the needs of Zionism as it's coming in as well, and looking at the city in a different way altogether, perhaps a more European city in some aspects of it. And so what happens during Storrs' time as governor, there are 3 town plans that are drawn up. One in 1918 by Maclean, one in 1919 by Patrick Geddes, and then Charles Ashby actually draws up a plan in 1922 as well. But what's interesting is not necessarily what's different between the plans, but what's similar. And so all 3 of them envision the old city detached from a new city of some sort. And so we see parks outside of the old city that are kind of removing it from the quote unquote new city. And what happens is we see the old city being preserved and confessionalized into quarters in a way that the inhabitants never would have imagined under Ottoman rule. It just wasn't something that was part of their everyday life. And so you see that idea of an Arab, a Jewish, a Christian, and Armenian quarter there, which was totally different to how the inhabitants of the old city conceived it under Ottoman rule. And so what we see as a legacy is that the new city starts to become associated more with European development and Zionism. And so that kind of legacy continues to some extent to this day with the emergence of a predominantly Jewish city in the west and then a predominantly Palestinian Arab city coming up in the east. And then the old city, the Arabs are almost presented as guardians of preservation, whereas the new city is seen as the guardians of modernity. And Storrs' interests always gravitate towards the old city, but even that in itself leads to him being accused in some cases of being anti-Zionist because he's not showing as great an interest in the planning of the new city and the new works that are going on there. But actually what it does is it, rather than showing him as an anti-Zionist, it just shows where his own personal agency and interests were. Again, that idea of him being the son of an Anglican priest is really important here. And the notion of Jerusalem as somewhere to be preserved really fits in with the old city, and that's his own personal interest. It's preservation for biblical posterity in many ways.
Let me move through the chronology of Jerusalem, and I want to move to 1920, which is a key event, certainly in the history of Jerusalem under Ronald Storrs, and you have a full chapter dedicated to the riots that occurred in April 1920. So here we see the outbreak of what I called personally the first example of semi-organized violence between Arab nationalists and Zionists. Can you talk about these events focusing on Storrs' role and responsibility?
Yeah, so it's key to understand when this happens in April of 1920 that Storrs is someone with a civilian background in a military administration. He's got a rank and title, but his understanding, his experiences of public security are not based on the same kind of worldview and outlook as someone with a military background would have had. And I think that helps us gauge his reaction and responses to what happens at the time. After the outbreak of violence, there's a government report that is commissioned, the Palin Commission, and they identify 2 key failings of Storrs. First of all, he failed to make adequate preparations, and secondly, that he failed to instruct the police to prevent inflammatory speeches. And I think the preparations section, the argument of what he was actually doing before the Nabi Musa festival is really telling, because if you look at what he's up to, well, he felt that the level of threat in 1920 was lower than in the previous year for the previous year's Nabi Musa. In the Palin Commission, it notes that he is alone of all the people who were talking at that time or talking to the commission in that view. And so what we see is he's actually more concerned with ensuring that there's a British military band performing, because that was what the Ottomans had traditionally provided. And there's a huge hoo-ha over whether this military band will be there or not to perform. But ultimately, Storrs feels that he's validated in this assessment that the threat was lower, given that the first day, on the Friday, passed peacefully. And that creates a sense of false confidence on that one. But I think it's really telling that, again, he's thinking of the aesthetic and the politics of perception. How are we going to be made to look during this festival? Now, when violence breaks out on the Sunday, Storrs immediately determines that he's going to be a visible presence on the streets of Jerusalem. That's his response. Again, he figures that the mere presence of a military governor is designed to reassure and to calm down whatever event is going on. And he also has various meetings with Rutenberg and Jabotinsky, the Zionists, on Sunday, and they discuss how to safeguard the Jewish community. Both Rutenberg and Jabotinsky suggest, well, can we be armed? Can we create some kind of Jewish battalion or brigade to try and protect Jewish civilians? And Storrs refuses to do that. He refuses to provide arms for them. And then later that day, there's this fateful meeting that takes place around about 6 o'clock on the Sunday, where the decision is made that all troops are going to be removed from the central areas of the old city from 6 a.m. on Monday, except for one platoon who were going to be at the Haram al-Sharif. Now, it's not clear who exactly gave this order. So there is some suggestion that it might have been Storrs, but it highlights his position as a civilian with a military rank, because his priority was to restore the city to normality, to give the sense that somehow the danger had passed. There was no need for military presence. If we have this normality, then everything will settle down. But it failed to recognize two things. As you said, it's this first moment of semi-organized violence between Palestinian Arabs and Zionists. And it didn't recognize, and it's a blind spot, not just with Storrs, but with other British officials as well, that Palestinian Arabs have concerns over the Balfour Declaration, and the Zionists are coming from it from the point of view of experience of pogroms in Eastern Europe and violence there. And so what it did, this response to kind of remove the military out, opened Storrs up to criticisms from both sides, particularly the Zionists, who declare that this is a pogrom. There's no two ways about it. They are very, very vocal in their criticisms of Storrs. Storrs tries to defend his position, saying that the disturbances were spontaneous. And that also was a point that was made in the Palin report. There was a suggestion of spontaneity, but again, it didn't really recognize the level of discontent against British policy at this time. In the months before Nabi Musa, there had been issues, increased attacks on Zionist communities in March of 1920, and obviously the wider kind of context of what was happening in Syria as well, and ideas of a greater Syria. All of that didn't really come into the equation for Storrs or a lot of the British. And rather than actually acknowledging the position that the British have found themselves in, and Storrs in particular, what Storrs instead decides he's going to do is he's going to place blame on Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the younger brother of the Mufti of Jerusalem, Kamil al-Husseini. And there is how should I put it? There's a concerted basically campaign against Haj Amin. He ends up getting sentenced for his role in the riots, and I think it's sentenced for 10 years in prison off the top of my head. And so what happens is that Storrs, rather than looking at what Britain is doing, is no, this is very clearly an Arab issue. And he, in the aftermath of this as well, removes Musa Kazim al-Husseini as mayor and replaces him with Nashashibi, which is basically a classic divide and rule thing. And what it does is it weakens the Palestinian position. It pits these two major families, notable families in Jerusalem, against each other. And I think Awad Halabi has done an awful lot of research into the history of Nabi Musa, not just under British rule, but across Ottoman into British rule. And he makes the argument that the British viewed the causes of the riots as a result of racial typologies of Jews and Arabs, that Jews were clannish and politically aggressive, and somehow the Arabs were easy to manipulate and prone to violence. And therefore, actually, only British rule could possibly reconcile the two on that front. And I think it's also worth noting that Palin was never published. And the reason for that is partly because things had calmed down. There was a new civilian rule, and there was this sense that, is it worth opening up old wounds again? You know, we've got new civilian rule. Things seem to be calmer. Do we need to remind people of what happened at this time? But also, it's because Palin was quite critical of British support for Zionism too, which, if it was published, would have put the British in a difficult position. But from Storrs's point of view, personally, all of a sudden, this kind of great ideal that he had, as envisioned in the pro-Jerusalem Society, of bringing the communities together through architecture and culture and so on and so forth, suddenly appears incredibly naive, because he's being attacked from both sides as interfering and not representing their points of view. And so we see almost like a detachment from the reality of Jerusalem as to how Storrs is really conceiving it and perceiving it.
Actually, that made me think about something I wanted to ask you at the very end, but perhaps I'm going to anticipate that question. Do you think that would be, or could be, the reason why Storrs got completely forgotten in Jerusalem? In the fact that, it's unclear which sides he would support. And, we understand that later on taking sides had become very important. Or do you think there are other reasons why Ronald Storrs, his work, had been forgotten throughout time?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good point. This idea that Storrs, in his position, because he was being attacked from both sides, didn't neatly fit into either position, either camp. And therefore, in terms of thinking about his work and his legacy, it's easy then to write him out. There's no street named after him at all. When you consider that he was there for 8 years, it's quite remarkable. And okay, I know that there's been a lot of street names changed over time, particularly after 67 and so on and so forth. But to not have any recognition whatsoever of the man at all. And as you said earlier, that you would ask about pro-Jerusalem or Ronald Storrs, and the Jerusalemites would be like, sorry, what? Who? I think that there is this idea that because he didn't neatly fit into either camp, then he's damaged goods, and therefore you drop him, and it doesn't fit into a comfortable narrative with either of them.
Now, let me move forward with the life of Ronald Storrs. So, Storrs was eventually named governor of Cyprus in 1926, which should have been a promotion, but we know, as he wrote in his memoirs, that actually he would have cherished to stay in Jerusalem for longer rather than moving away. Can you tell us more about his work in Jerusalem between 1920 and his dismissal as civil governor of Jerusalem? And I'm also curious to hear more about the question that you already talked about earlier, but perhaps if you have more details about this idea that he was considered anti-Zionist by the Zionists, anti-Arab by Arab nationalists, and how that interactions between these groups with Ronald Storrs eventually had an impact on Ronald Storrs' successive career.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, after Nabi Musa, his reputation is damaged. There's no two ways about it. And I think it's quite telling that what he tries to do when we hit the years of civilian administration is he still tries to use clubs and societies as a method to bring communities together and fulfill his own personal need for society as well. So he's very important in the establishment of a Jerusalem sports club. He's gets involved in a Jerusalem dramatic society as well, and also looks at setting up a Jerusalem music school and a Palestine opera association. Now, I think it's quite telling that the sports club and the dramatic society end up being dominated by British officials on that front. There isn't a huge amount of interest from the other communities in that. And the music school ultimately gets handed over to the Zionist Commission due to a lack of interest from the other communities. So these vehicles that he sees as bringing people together actually end up kind of fragmenting them a little bit. And with the Palestine Opera Association, that just didn't get off the ground at all. There were kind of feelers put out, and from his point of view, it never came off. There was later an opera association that was set up, but it wasn't with Storrs' involvement at all. And I think that there was almost too much mistrust for these personal ventures to work. His tactics that had initially worked under under OETA, like a multi-denominational chess club he set up, now appeared disingenuous because of the position that he was in. That's partly a result of Storrs's actions as governor, but that's also partly because of wider events that are going on too. So from 1922, the Balfour Declaration becomes part of Britain's mandate for the League of Nations. And we see during this time, while some historians view the 1920s in Palestine as this peaceful time, almost a very calm time. Actually, what we're seeing is the fragmentation of society going on there. We see a development of an exclusively Jewish economy and system of government, whilst at the same time Palestinian Arabs are questioning, well, where is our representation, and so on and so forth. And so it's very much a surface level idea that there is peace and harmony there. All of the issues that are going to emerge from 1929 onwards are very much in development. And I think what's interesting is that he gets the most personal attacks, I would say, of officials out there, of British officials. And I think the reason for that is because of those that personal style of rule that he exhibits. It angers people even more that you could be in his confidences and be socializing and then at the same time be betrayed, for want of a better word. And so his attempts to bring those communities together probably would have worked if he was a neutral arbiter, but at the end of the day, he wasn't. He was a British official, and that added an extra layer that he was never, ever really able to overcome. And so by the time we hit 1926, we see that his position is becoming more and more difficult, and he's aware of that as well.
So in conclusion, as we said earlier, he was named governor of Cyprus in 1926, where he had a rough time there too. His house was burned down, effectively. And then he was sent to Africa, where he never felt comfortable. Can you tell us a little bit more about his post-Jerusalem life and your final assessment of his work and legacy?
Yeah, so he's in Cyprus for 6 years. So again, a sizable amount of time from 1926 to 32. And given his background in classics, he arrives expressing a love of ancient Greek civilization, and very similarly to his position in Jerusalem, where he spoke Arabic and was learning Hebrew and tried to show an interest in the communities, tried to do the same in Cyprus, but at a time when Greek Cypriots were campaigning for a gnosis or unification with Greece. And what he tried to do was create an image of a harmonious Cyprus whilst he was governor there, just as he did in Jerusalem. And the key to that harmony was going to be British rule and Storrs' governorship. And unsurprisingly, we see a lot of parallels then starting to emerge between his time in Jerusalem and his time in Cyprus. There are pro-Gnosis riots in October 1931, which, as you mentioned, see his house burnt down, destroying his personal papers. And we see pro-Gnosis politicians start to accuse him of hypocrisy. They say, here is a man who loves Greece, who purports to love our civilization, yet he will not allow Greek Cypriot unification. And so again, there's this kind of accusation of hypocrisy made against him. There's clear parallels with his time in Jerusalem, where he's saying, I'm not for either, I'm for both. You know, it's fine, don't worry about it. British rule will calm everything down. Shortly after his house is burnt down, 1932 to 34, as you say, he goes to North Rhodesia. He suffers from ill health there. He really never settles at all, and returns to England and starts to position himself as an expert on Palestine and Zionism. His autobiography, Orientations, really starts that trend. And then he also does radio broadcasts on the topic of Zionism. He does speaking tours and things like that as well. He worked as well for the Committee for Arab Affairs based in London, which throughout the 1940s was looking to prevent the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. But what's interesting is that doesn't necessarily mean that he is an anti-Zionist. It's more, how did he conceive of Zionism? And by this time, the idea of Zionism just being a Jewish homeland in the 1940s is morphing into something very different. It's morphing into a Jewish state. And so I always kind of see Storrs as being almost this, like, classical follower of the Balfour Declaration, that it's all about a Jewish homeland. It's not about a Jewish state. And that's how he tries to navigate this idea of, I'm not for either, I'm for both, okay? And so actually there's an awful lot of consistency in his views, even from 1926 when he left, all the way into the 1940s. The way I kind of conceive Storrs, though, is that he had a hierarchy of interests. And so firstly, you've got Jerusalem and British policy, and it's not always clear which way round he was actually pursuing them. Sometimes his love of Jerusalem and what he wanted came above the British policy and vice versa. But as part of that British policy, obviously, was the fulfillment of the Balfour Declaration. And so to that extent, in his hierarchy of interests, you have to put Zionism as third on the list. And then it's in fourth is the Palestinian Arabs, who ultimately would be undermined by his policies as governor of Jerusalem at this time. I think he's an interesting person in that there was genuine sincerity. I think his interests in Judaism, in Hebrew culture, in Arab culture, there was a sincerity about it with him. But also, we've got to bear in mind that he is a product of the colonial zeitgeist as well. And that's where difficulties come. The reason why he kind of had this personal approach, though, is ultimately rooted in his background. His determining imprint saw him, how he viewed Jerusalem change over time, you know. And so we've got this idea of the old city versus new. It ended up as a more divided city, which had an impact today. And so that personal impact that he had, that personal approach, contributed to those divisions, because, as I said, he was raising the hopes and expectations of communities and ultimately dashing them as well, creating mistrust and disharmony.
One last question. Is there anything that I didn't ask, but you think it would be important to discuss?
I think possibly looking at the idea of the role of the individual in history, and this idea that labels are often used to homogenize. You know, we can say that X is this and Y is that, and so on and so forth. And I think it's always important when we're starting to look at those labels is to try and look at that background and personality as well, because it's not just about the impact of the spirit of the time on the individual. It's how the individual interprets that circumstance that they find themselves dealing with, and how they interpret the kind of the dominant trends of the time is really important too. And that's what I was ultimately trying to do with Storrs, is to say, yes, he was a product of his times, but he also had a worldview that was recognized at the time as being quite unique, and an approach that was quite unique.
This was Christopher Burhnham, author of Sir Ronald Storrs, Personality and Policy in Mandate Palestine, 1917-1926. The book has been published by Routledge in 2024. Christopher, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.